when a 6'9" man weighing 250 pounds pulled his matte black SUV into a Target parking lot in Akron, Ohio. On a chilly Tuesday morning in November, his internal clock was ticking. He had a tight schedule. He had a board meeting for a new lifetime partnership waiting for him downtown. He had business executives expecting him in less than an hour. His whole day was calculated down to the second. But a sudden movement outside his window made him lift his foot from the gas. Through the tinted glass of his vehicle in the corner of an ordinary parking lot on West Market Street, he witnessed something that made him shift the gear into park and sit in absolute silence. A woman was sitting alone in a faded gray Ford Focus. Her forehead was pressed hard against the plastic steering wheel. Her shoulders were shaking under a worn woolen coat. She was weeping, and it was not the quiet crying of someone having a difficult afternoon. This was the raw, suffocating release of a person who had been carrying an impossible weight for months, and her body had finally run out of room to hold it anymore. She had no idea anyone was looking. She had no idea who was looking. Her name was Clara Finch, and she was a third-grade teacher at Oakridge Elementary School. She had 22 children depending on her every single day. She had spent exactly $345 of her own paycheck that month buying basic color crayons and notebooks for students who had arrived on the first day of school with empty hands. Not because they were careless, but because their parents were choosing between school supplies and electricity bills. Clara looked at her phone screen. Her checking account showed exactly $25 remaining. She had driven to this Target to buy either lined paper or safety scissors for her classroom, because her remaining balance could not cover both. She was trapped in the quiet cruelty of that choice. That was why she was breaking down. Now, this is where the ordinary world cracks open, because the man sitting 2 spaces away in that quiet SUV was not just a passerby. He was LeBron James, 4-time NBA champion, a billionaire icon, one of the most recognizable faces on the face of the earth. He was a man who could have easily ignored the scene, rolled right out of the lot, and no one would have ever questioned his absence. He did not drive away. He switched off the ignition. He stepped down onto the cold asphalt. He walked past the shopping carts, straight toward that beaten-up Ford Focus, and he knocked gently on the passenger side window. What followed over the next few days would eventually be witnessed by millions of people across the country. What he uncovered behind the closed doors of that underfunded school would spark a national conversation about dignity and human value. And the quiet words he whispered to one small boy, an 8-year-old named Owen, who sat in the second row of room 9, wearing a rubber wristband that had grown completely smooth from age, would remain a secret for 4 long days. When that secret finally came to light, in a packed auditorium filled with reporters and flashing cameras, there was a profound silence that settled over the entire neighborhood. Stay with us for the entire journey. Because what LeBron James did next, beginning with 4 simple words spoken to a crying teacher in a cold parking lot, is something that strips away the glitz of celebrity and reminds us what it actually means to look at another human being with respect. Clara Finch was 32 years old. She had dedicated 7 years of her life to the classrooms of Oakridge Elementary, a school where the bare statistics painted a grim picture long before you ever set foot on the property. According to the state records, 89% of the children at Oakridge qualified for the Federal Assistance Lunch Program. That is a number that easy policy documents use to balance their ledgers. But Clara saw the human faces behind the math. It meant that almost every child who stepped off the yellow bus at 7 in the morning came from a home that was one flat tire or one medical bill away from a catastrophe. Some families were already living in that catastrophe. Clara knew every single one of them by name. She knew their stories, their fears, and the quiet dignity they tried to maintain despite the cracks in their world. She was exceptional at her job, but she was fighting a losing war against a budget that treated her students like numbers on a spreadsheet. She drove a 2011 Ford Focus with 194,000 miles on the odometer. The driver's side mirror was secured with 3 strips of dark gray duct tape, and the heat took exactly 14 minutes to kick in after the engine started. Her back seat was a rolling storage unit filled with plastic storage bins, construction paper scraps, and extra winter coats she kept for children who arrived in November shivering. That morning, her hands were trembling as she turned off the car. She had spent the last 20 minutes staring at the Target entrance, trying to make 41. $25 do the work of 100. She did the math 3 times on a scrap piece of paper, using her pen to press down hard into the wood of her dashboard. Lined paper or scissors. One choice meant her children could not write their essays. The other meant they could not finish their art projects. She closed her eyes and let her head sink onto the wheel. "I am not crying because I am weak," she would say later to a close friend. "I am crying because I have been the anchor for everyone else for so long that my own ropes are fraying." She has never heard the heavy thud of the SUV door closing 2 spots over. She never saw the massive figure approaching through the morning fog. She only woke from her despair when a soft, rhythmic knock echoed against the cold glass of her passenger window, and she looked up to see a man crouching down to meet her gaze, his face filled with an old, familiar understanding of what it feels like to have nothing but your own survival. LeBron James looked at her through the glass. He was miles away from the bright lights of the arena, miles away from the cameras and the luxury brands that surrounded his public life. He adjusted his winter cap, looked at her tear-stained face, and spoke 4 quiet words that cut through the silence of the morning. "Hey, you okay, sis?" Clara Finch sat entirely motionless in the driver's seat for exactly 43 seconds, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the towering figure standing just outside her car door. It was a face that felt completely impossible to encounter in a place like this, a face that dominated giant billboards downtown, headlined global sports networks, and inspired the dreams of millions of children who ever picked up a basketball. She desperately used the sleeve of her blue knitted cardigan, the one with a small fraying hole near the left elbow, that she always forgot to mend, to wipe away the heavy tears from her cheeks. She lowered the window just a few inches, allowing the biting November air of Akron to rush into the cramped cabin. "I am fine," she said, her voice cracking, pitched so low it was nearly swallowed by the distant rumble of a delivery truck. "I am just a bit tired from grading papers late into the night." But LeBron James did not move, nor did he offer the empty, polite nods that most strangers resort to when confronted with someone else's raw vulnerability. He had learned a foundational truth from his mother, Gloria James, during their hardest years in this very city. He knew that silence was not an awkward void that needed to be filled with polite noise, but rather a space that required a steady, unyielding presence so another human being wouldn't feel completely abandoned in their dark moment. He looked at her swollen, red-rimmed eyes, then glanced down at the scrap paper on her passenger seat, covered in frantic, scribbled calculations of her remaining salary. He asked her if she would mind walking across the asphalt to a small, quiet donut shop called the Corner Bakery, a place where local mechanics and bus drivers gathered before the morning shift. 20 minutes later, they were seated across from each other in a secluded booth at the back of the diner, where the thick scent of fried dough mingled with old coffee grounds and the rhythmic, low hiss of an ancient radiator mounted on the wall. LeBron James, a man whose massive frame took up nearly 2/3 of the cracked red vinyl booth, held a plain white ceramic mug filled with dark coffee. Opposite him sat Clara, her hands tightly wrapped around a warm mug of tea as if it were the only anchor keeping her tethered to reality. He did not press her for explanations, nor did he probe with the prying curiosity or condescending pity of a billionaire looking down at a struggling worker. He simply sat there and listened, and the absolute respect in his quiet demeanor was what caused the final defensive walls of the young teacher to completely dissolve. She began to speak about Room 9 at Oakridge Elementary School, a space measuring less than 500 square feet that served as a daily sanctuary for 22 different lives. She described the pale green paint on the walls that had been peeling off in heavy flakes since last autumn because the district had denied the budget for maintenance. She described the central whiteboard, its plastic surface worn so smooth over a decade of use that dry erase markers could no longer grip the board, forcing her to press down with the full weight of her wrist to write out the day's equations so the children in the very back row could copy them. But what truly made LeBron's chest tighten was not the breakdown of the physical building, but the precise, heartbreaking details of how these 8-year-old children experienced the quiet weight of poverty. Clara spoke about Owen, a boy with incredibly sharp eyes who spent his days trying to make himself as small as possible so no one would notice his faded jeans, which stopped several inches above his ankles. Owen was the oldest of 3 brothers, and his mother worked grueling 10-hour shifts at an industrial laundry facility 3 miles down the road, standing over roaring steam presses for minimum wage just to keep the lights on in their apartment. Owen did not own a colorful plastic pencil box filled with brand-new supplies like the kids in the wealthy western suburbs. He possessed a single wooden pencil, a pencil that had snapped completely in half weeks ago, and was meticulously held together by a tight wrap of purple electrical tape. Every morning, before the first bell rang, Owen would walk over to the manual pencil sharpener mounted on the wall, turning the metal handle exactly 4 times with absolute precision. He never turned it 3 times, and he never turned it 5. An 8-year-old child had learned to ration the remaining millimeters of graphite because it was the only tool he had to build his future. Clara's voice hitched as she recounted a rainy afternoon from the previous week when a little girl named Mia accidentally dropped her only eraser down a deep crack in the old floorboards. Without a single complaint or a moment of hesitation, Owen had pulled out his taped pencil, used his fingernails to carefully slice his tiny eraser in half, and slid the remaining portion across the desk to Mia without saying a word. The children at Oakridge were not taught the concepts of empathy through grand theoretical speeches. They practiced it as a raw instinct of survival to protect each other's dignity in a world that had given them very little. On Owen's thin left wrist, he wore a neon orange rubber band that had grown completely smooth and faded from age, bearing the faint, almost invisible letters, "I promise." It was a discarded band he had found on a sidewalk months ago, a symbol belonging to LeBron's own charitable foundation. The boy wore it every single day, like an absolute article of faith. A constant reminder that if he worked hard enough and became an engineer, he would build massive steel bridges to carry his family away from the struggles of the inner city. Sitting in the dim light of that booth, LeBron James felt a cold chill run down his spine, pulling his mind back to the freezing winters of his own childhood in Akron during the early 1990s. He saw Owen's reflection staring back at him through the story of Owen. He remembered the suffocating instability of moving through 7 different rental apartments with his mother, Gloria, in a single year, the nights they sat in the dark using candles for warmth, and the winter of 4th grade when he missed 82 days of school simply because they had no car, no bus fare, and his only pair of sneakers had split open at the toe. He had been that exact child, sitting silently at a desk with the paralyzing fear that his classmates would discover his backpack contained only 1 notebook used for every single subject. The immense wealth, the multi-million-dollar contracts, the glittering championship rings, and the relentless speed of his current life had created a distance, a heavy velvet curtain that obscured the reality that on the very streets he used to walk, teachers were still breaking down because they couldn't afford paper for their students. LeBron placed his heavy mug on the table, the ceramic striking the wood with a dull, definitive thud. He looked straight into Clara's eyes, his expression shifting from basic sympathy into the ironclad resolve of a man who had just found a critical mission. "Send me the list," he said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that brooked no argument. "Send me everything Room 9 needs, from a single pencil to the whiteboard, and do not leave out a single thing." The transition from the quiet warmth of the local donut shop to the sterile administrative wing of Oakridge Elementary felt like walking straight into a wall of solid ice. Clara Finch stood beside Principal Arthur Vance in the central hallway of the school, watching the children line up for their mid-morning recess. Arthur was 54 years old, a man whose hair had gone completely gray over a decade of managing a school that the city's budget planners seemed to have completely forgotten. He was holding a worn manila folder thicker than a brick, stuffed to the margins with maintenance requests, heating repair invoices from January, and a desperate proposal for a new literacy curriculum that had been denied 3 consecutive times by the school district board. He looked at Clara, his eyes showing the quiet, exhausting defeat of a man who spent more time fighting paperwork than helping children. "We have to go downtown to the Central District office at 11, Arthur whispered, his voice dry and strained. "The new district financial director is reviewing emergency requests today, but the secretary told me on the phone not to expect a miracle." The central office of the school district was located in a towering glass and steel building downtown, a stark contrast to the cracked brick and peeling paint of Oakridge Elementary. Sitting behind a monolithic mahogany desk on the top floor was Thomas Sterling, the newly appointed chief financial officer. Sterling was 42 years old, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, with a platinum watch that caught the midday sunlight every time he adjusted his cuffs. He was the epitome of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. A man who viewed education not through the eyes of children, but through the columns of a cost-benefit analysis spreadsheet. To him, words like optimization, protocol, and asset reallocation were weapons used to shave dollars off the public budget to make his administrative portfolio look immaculate to the state investors. He did not look up when Clara and Arthur entered the room. He let them stand in front of his desk for exactly 52 seconds, while he finished typing a memo on his sleek silver laptop, establishing a heavy, uncomfortable tension in the room. When Sterling finally raised his head, his eyes were devoid of any human warmth. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Well, Arthur," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial politeness, "I reviewed your submission for the emergency funding grant for Oakridge. You are asking for $22,000 for technological upgrades, a complete overhaul of the whiteboard surfaces in 4 classrooms, and an immediate repair of the boiler unit in the basement." He paused, letting out a short, cynical chuckle that made Clara's hands clench into tight fists inside her coat pockets. "I have to say, this is an exceptional exercise in fiscal irresponsibility." Arthur took a step forward, his voice tight but controlled. "Mr. Sterling, the boiler failed twice last week. The temperature in the 3rd grade hallway dropped to 48 degrees on Thursday. My teachers are buying their own dry erase markers and paper because the supply room has been empty since October." Sterling's expression hardened, the mask of politeness slipping away to reveal a deep, self-righteous arrogance. He placed his palms flat on the desk and leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you about protocol, Arthur," Sterling said, his tone sharpening like a blade. "The district operates on strict budgetary boundaries. We do not subsidize the inefficiency of individual schools. If your teachers are spending their own money, that is a personal choice, not a systemic failure. Perhaps if your staff spent less time creating emotional excuses and more time optimizing the existing resources, your test scores would justify an increase in asset allocation." Clara could feel the blood rushing to her ears, the memory of Owen's taped pencil and the $25 in her bank account flashing behind her eyes. She stepped forward, ignoring the warning glance from Arthur. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and pure anger. We are talking about children who don't have pencils to write their names. We are talking about human beings, not data points on your computer screen. Thomas Sterling looked at Clara as if she were an annoying insect that had drifted into his pristine office. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he did something far worse, an action designed to inflict maximum humiliation through the sheer abuse of authority. He reached out, took the thick manila folder containing years of Oakridge's documented struggles from Arthur's hands, and held it over the large metal trash bin beside his desk. "This meeting is over," Sterling said quietly, his eyes locked onto Clara's with a cold, terrifying emptiness. "Your requests are formally denied for failing to meet the district's optimal viability standards. Go back to your classrooms and work within the system." With a flick of his wrist, he dropped the folder into the trash. The heavy thud of the paperwork hitting the bottom of the bin echoed through the silent office like a gavel. Arthur Vance stood entirely frozen, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek, while Clara felt a tear of pure, unadulterated frustration slip down her face. They were dismissed, crushed by a man who hid his cruelty behind the word policy. Thomas Sterling spent his Wednesday afternoon reviewing a newly updated luxury real estate catalog, sipping sparkling water from a crystal tumbler. He felt completely untouchable behind his mahogany desk. He believed the world was divided into two distinct categories: those who managed resources and those who were managed by them. He had already forgotten the crying teacher and the gray-haired principal who had stood in his office the day before. But at exactly 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the heavy double doors of the Central District boardroom were pushed open without warning. Sterling looked up, an irritated remark rising to his lips, but the words died in his throat as a group of investigators dressed in dark, formal suits walked into the room, followed closely by Arthur Vance and Clara Finch. Leading the group was a senior legal representative from the LeBron James Family Foundation, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that she placed onto the center of the conference table with a sharp, echoing thud. Sterling's face paled slightly, his platinum watch catching the light as his hands began to tremble on his laptop keyboard. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Sterling demanded, his voice losing its smooth composure. "This is a private administrative session, and you are violating district protocol." The legal representative did not answer him with words. Instead, she opened the briefcase and pulled out a massive 4-inch thick document bound in black leather, placing it directly over Sterling's open laptop. "We are not here to discuss your protocol, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical tone that filled the room with an immediate, suffocating tension. "We are here to talk about a systematic pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and the deliberate deprivation of public school resources. For the past 48 hours, our foundation's forensic accountants and independent investigators have been digging into your financial portfolio." Sterling tried to laugh, but the sound was thin, dry, and hollow. "This is absurd," he stammered, pulling at his silk tie. "My books are audited by the state every single year, and everything is optimized to the highest standards." The lawyer smiled, a sharp, humorless movement of her lips, and stepped back to allow 3 individuals to walk into the boardroom from the hallway. The first individual to step forward was David Miller, a local commercial contractor whose hair was dusty with drywall plaster. He looked straight into Sterling's eyes, his voice steady with years of buried resentment. "3 years ago, my company won the bid to repair the ventilation systems at Oakridge and 2 other schools," David said, his rough hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "We completed the work, but Mr. Sterling here forced us to accept a 40% reduction in our final payout, claiming the district had hit a sudden deficit. 2 weeks later, I watched him approve a luxury renovation project for his own executive office wing, using the exact same funding code. I filed a formal complaint with the board. but it disappeared from the system within 24 hours, and my company was blacklisted from ever working for the city again. Sterling shifted in his chair, his breathing growing noticeably heavier as the room seemed to shrink around him. The second witness was Margaret Higgins, a 62-year-old woman wearing the faded green uniform of a school custodian. She did not look afraid of the expensive suits in the room. She looked deeply tired. I worked at Oakridge for 19 years, keeping the hallways clean and making sure the children had soap in the restrooms, Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly, but filled with an undeniable dignity. Last winter, when the boiler broke down, I went to Mr. Sterling's assistance to beg for emergency parts because the pipes were freezing. Instead of sending help, he launched an administrative review against me, claiming I was wasting cleaning supplies and used a minor procedural error to terminate my employment without my pension. He didn't care that the children were shivering in class. He only cared about cutting the maintenance labor costs to hit his quarterly efficiency bonus. Clara watched Sterling's face turn an ash-gray color, his self-righteous mask completely shattering as the human cost of his spreadsheets was laid bare before him. The final witness was Marcus Vance, a young accountant who had worked directly under Sterling at the central office until 6 months ago. He placed a stack of certified digital bank ledger printouts on the table, pointing to a series of hidden line items. Mr. Sterling created a shadow accounting system under the guise of an asset reallocation protocol, Marcus explained, his tone completely detached and precise. He systematically denied the supply requests of Title I schools like Oakridge, reallocating those unused funds into a discretionary administrative account that he used to fund private corporate retreats, expensive tech consulting fees for his friends' firms, and his own personal travel expenses. I have the original unedited server logs right here, signed with his personal cryptographic key. Thomas Sterling sat completely rattled, his fingers twitching against his trousers as he stared at the mountain of evidence before him. He realized with a terrifying clarity that the system he had used to crush others had just turned around and completely crushed him. Thomas Sterling was formally stripped of his title by nightfall, his custom suit offering no protection as state auditors escorts him out of the building. The monolithic mahogany desk was completely cleared of his presence within days. The legal mechanisms moved swiftly, frozen assets reallocated directly to a public fund managed by an independent committee. But the true resolution did not unfold in the cold mahogany offices of downtown. Nor did it live in the legal definitions of the courtroom. It happened on Monday morning back at Oakridge Elementary School, inside the small square footage of Room 9. Clara Finch arrived at 7:15 in the morning, her old Ford Focus coughing in the crisp winter air as she parked in her regular spot. She unlocked the classroom door, flipped the light switch, and stood entirely frozen in the doorway as her tote bag slipped from her fingers. The broken, smooth whiteboard was completely gone, replaced by a massive, state-of-the-art interactive smartboard flush against the wall, glowing with a soft, warm light. On the screen, a message had been programmed in clear, friendly letters. "Good morning, Room 9. You are seen. You are valued. You matter." The entire reading corner had been completely transformed over the weekend by a quiet army of volunteers from the LeBron James Family Foundation. The old, faded rug she had salvaged from a garage sale was gone, replaced by a thick woven carpet in the deep gold and crimson colors of a classic Ohio sunset. Brand new bookshelves made of solid oak lined the back wall, packed to the margins with over 300 new books, sorted precisely by reading level and interest. A massive, deep blue beanbag chair sat in the corner beside a warm brass lamp, creating a space where a child could completely lose themselves in a story. Clara walked deeper into the room, her breath trembling as she looked at the desks. Every single student desk had a premium supply kit placed neatly in the center, containing folders, composition notebooks, colored pencils, safety scissors, and a personalized wooden pencil box. On top of Owen's desk sat a small, handwritten card signed by LeBron James himself, alongside a brand-new orange rubber wristband to replace the faded one he had worn for months. The card read, "For the future engineer who will build the bridges to carry us all forward. Keep dreaming, big young king." Clara pressed her palms flat against her face, her tears flowing freely as the sheer weight of her long, lonely struggle was completely washed away by a wave of dignity. At 8:04 in the morning, Owen walked through the door of room 9, his worn sneakers coming to a sudden halt as his eyes scanned the space. He looked at the glowing screen, the crimson rug, the stacked bookshelves, and finally, his own desk. He walked forward slowly, his hands trembling as he picked up the handwritten card and read the words twice, making sure his eyes weren't playing a trick on him. He looked up at Clara, and a profound expression shifted across his young face, the exact moment a child realizes that their secret dreams are not invisible to the world. He did not cry, but his small shoulders straightened with a quiet, mature gravity that belonged to someone twice his age. He took the new orange "I Promise" wristband, slid it over his left hand, and carefully placed his old, taped pencil inside the new wooden box, keeping it as a reminder of where he began. Meanwhile, a representative from the foundation stood in the hallway with Principal Arthur Vance, handing him a certified commitment letter, ensuring a 3-year financial endowment to upgrade every single classroom at Oakridge and completely repair the basement boiler system before the first heavy snowfall. The story did not end with the arrival of the supply trucks, because grand gestures mean very little if they do not create lasting changes in human lives. 2 months later, the Alachua County School Board, facing immense public pressure from the exposure of Sterling shadow accounts, officially approved a $3 million increase in public classroom supply allocations. It was the largest single-budget expansion for underfunded schools in 11 years. Owen's mother, Keisha, was accepted into a fully funded medical technician training program sponsored by the foundation, allowing her to leave her grueling laundry shifts behind and secure a stable, single-shift position at the city hospital. For the first time in his life, Owen came home from school to find his mother already waiting in the kitchen, the smell of a warm dinner filling their small apartment. They sat down together at the table, an ordinary family sharing a quiet evening, completely safe from the suffocating anxiety of the system. On a late Tuesday afternoon in November, long after the cameras had left and the heavy folding chairs had been stacked away in the gymnasium, Clara Finch stood outside the school by her old Ford Focus. The car still had the purple electrical tape on the dashboard, a detail she chose to keep because it reminded her of the morning everything changed. LeBron James pulled his black SUV along the curb, rolling down the window to look at the quiet school building. He did not step out, nor did he look for applause or recognition from the passing pedestrians. He simply looked at Clara, offering a small, knowing nod of profound respect between two individuals who had both refused to look away from the struggle. We are not very good at talking about attention in a world that worships wealth and fame, but the decision to look, to stop, and to listen is the most powerful resource we possess. Every bridge begins with a single person who looks at the distance between human beings and decides it is worth closing. LeBron rolled up his window and quietly drove away into the evening fog, leaving behind a school that finally had the tools to build its own future.